Hello, and welcome to Countering Persistent Threat Actors in APAC and globally. If you're joining us live, our speakers are in the Slido discussion answering your questions right now. For audio-video issues, click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Stephen Desa and Vincent Wong.
Thanks, Casey. Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Desa, and I've got along with me Vincent Wong, who's from the Mandiant IR team. Both of us will be talking today over the next 30 minutes about our experiences dealing with threat actors in APAC, some observations that we have that we could share with you, and also some lessons. I'm going to quickly jump into some quick introductions, setting the background, and Vincent and I will share some insights with you. Vincent, if you want to turn on your camera, we'll be able to see you. Hey, Vincent.
Sure
Vincent's been working with me on investigations. He comes with a background with the federal police, but he spent the last 5 years along with me dealing with incidences across APJ. And we'll be sharing, some details about, some of the interesting changes that we've seen in terms of threat actors trying to stay in the environment. I've been doing this for a lot longer, and happy to share insights. Again, through this whole session, if you have any questions, just drop a note in Slido, and we'll try and answer it as quickly as we can. Over the next 30 minutes, what we'll do is talk a little bit about what we are observing in terms of state of the hack, some advancements on threat actors, some intrusion details that we saw them take, backdoors which are of interest, and some interesting analysis from recent investigations. We do want to leave you with some lessons that we learned that you could also apply in your environment. So, just to recap the goals, the first one being latest techniques, the second one being some interesting data theft that we've seen that attackers rely on. Setting base, because I think this is what is important when you're trying to counter these threat actors. And finally, as I mentioned, some tactical guidance that you can immediately use, and some strategic guidance that you can plan for over the short time in your organization. Just to set the background, Mandiant sees investigations across the globe. We release something called M-Trends every year, but this is one of the statistics that we like to share. And I've kind of juxtaposed that for the last 2 years. We've seen attackers reattempt to gain access about 1 in 3 times over the last 12 months for organizations where we're dealing with incident response. In APJ, and I'm taking a year back, the number was close to about 9 out of 10 times. What we're seeing is attackers, once they get in, once they have some information about the organization, are reattempting to get in. And this is a very important statistic and an important background in terms of how you should be planning to or counter these threat actors. Just in terms of the background, the state of the hack is we're not dealing with commodity threat actors. We're looking at threat actors who would be hands on keyboards, try and be extremely less noisy in the environment, try to live off the land where they can, use existing tools, and the attackers trying to manipulate the way they're maintaining persistence longer in the environment. And I think this is one of the key aspects that attackers continue to stay longer, because they have an ability to evade or find that's a blind spot in the security team's remediation measures to stay in longer and kind of reset the whole effort that the blue team's been doing. Now, the adversaries do know that the blue teams do have certain constraints. There is limited visibility across the environment. No blue team's got unlimited budgets. We're all working with constraints, bandwidth, time limitations. Sometimes there are businesses that need to operate with, certain limitations where security software coverage is at best, about 70 to 80%, and there are some blind spots there. And attackers use these constraints to try and add, last-minute changes to their techniques so that they can evade that final push to clean the environment and stay in longer. So, that's the background for the rest of the talk. And I'll pass it to Vincent very shortly in terms of sharing some of the details. When we talk about threat actors, I also want to kind of paint out the landscape, right? We're dealing with not with a human on the keyboard. There are variations in the ways they would attack, and these are not individuals. These are more well-funded groups or organizations trying to get in and stay in your environment. And the third part, that's the most important one, that if you kick them out, you have to be very coordinated while doing that, but also have visibility that these threat actors, they're motivated to stay in longer and have a higher return on the investment that they're making. And they would manage those risks. And we can talk about some of the ways that they manage those risks to get back in, because this is one of their objectives, that if you kick them out, they would want to return back in. Case in point was APD1. When we had the report that went out in 2014, one of the things that we saw was, the day the report went out, we saw them make changes. We saw them, part domains, clear out the staging directories, take off the tools and change the tools so that if they could evade any cleanup, they could be in the environment a little longer. They did retool, came back in, but we haven't seen APD1 for a very long time. I'll pass it to Vincent to talk a little bit about the advancement from threat actors and give some examples to outline that. Vince?
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Stephen. So how we've seen the evolution of tooling is something as simple as Mimikatz. So for instance, on the top left-hand screen over there, you can see the very first iteration of Mimikatz was a binary file, DLL file. You have to load a driver for it to execute successfully. On the right-hand side, you can see the second iteration of Mimikatz where it's getting called using PowerShell. At the bottom left, you can see the third iteration of using Mimikatz, so using procdump, a Microsoft commonly available tool to dump a particular process called the LSAS process, which contains a lot of the credentials where a lot of your information and passwords are stored and hashes. Now, a lot of EDR tools are catching on to that. Attackers obviously know this, so they're moving on to the next iteration, which is using another living off the land technique called run DLL32, which is calling like a DLL service that's built into Windows, and then calling a very particular process ID to dump the LSAS process as well. And then typically the attacker would take this off and conduct the cracking and hash analysis that way. Now, in terms of avenues of return, these are the top four things that we usually see from attackers. So prior knowledge, obviously, if they lived in your environment for a little while and they started exfiltrating your data, they would have prior knowledge of how you operated, what passwords might have been changed, and what might not work and might work as well. In terms of backdoors, which we'll dig into a little bit deeper as well, sometimes they're not identified fully. As Stephen said, there are constraints in budget, timing, and also expertise as well to finding some of these backdoors. Next is exploits. So we'll also dig into this as well a little bit later on. But we have seen early use of exploits, especially in Apache Struts. Everybody knows about this, but also a whole bunch of ones which are which we also dealt with recently in 2019 and 2020. And supply chain attacks, especially the MSSPs and service providers, where they have been used as an exploit point to move into the environment. So.
Thanks, Vince. In terms of just that background, just jumping in terms of the prior knowledge, these are some of the examples that we saw where Active Directory database data moving outside the environment. But there are other things that are also, fairly important that attackers typically go try that they can reuse. What we've seen is network diagrams to find shadow IT or internal recon data, especially for third-party VPNs, using that as a way to get into the environment. We've seen attackers take data from internal portals because those are some of those locations where security may not be applied that strongly. People will have access to enterprise architecture, organization charts, or individuals that can be targeted further to get into the environment. And one of the things that I've seen has been architecture diagrams, which don't get enough attention, and attackers use that to get back into the environment. And we've seen that repeat multiple times. Vince, if you want to talk a little bit about the backdoors, I think this is one of the topics of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the most recent backdoors we've seen is some of these techniques we have listed down. So remote desktop tunneling, web shells placed on internet-facing infrastructure, persistence mechanisms which may not be caught, golden tickets, and some variants on other backdoors seen as well. We also touch on things like exploits we've also seen as well. So RDP tunneling is a really is fairly simple, but also pretty devastating. So typically you can see on the right hand side, typically you won't allow inbound connections to your internal infrastructure generally. But generally, we've seen a lot of enterprises allow outbound connections, which are fairly open sometimes. So, for instance, in the top diagram, you can see the attacker has obtained access to that victim system and then and have initiated an outbound connection. Is able to initiate an outbound connection. In the bottom one, they have access to that system and they've actually executed P-Link. So P-Link, commonly available tool, publicly available tool, and they've set up a forwarding listening type setup there, where you would actually set up a connection to an external TCP server to the internet. Now, how the attacker can use this tunnel, so instead of just being restricted to just text commands, they can actually build a tunnel. So you can see here it's building a tunnel for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, building a tunnel back to the victim system on the right-hand side there, and that gives them a full GUI or hands, keyboard, and mouse access to that endpoint to perform whatever activity they need to do. So that's one example we've seen in recent projects. Web shells, another really common backdoor, where we do see if the attacker has ability to access web servers, they'll generally put in this web shell. So a web shell is just a script that would run kind of like a normal web page, and then depending on the user context of the process that's running, you can actually execute a number of commands. So here on the top, you can see it affects a PHP Linux web server, and the attacker has just put in a diff, to see what drives are mounted, and then in the output window, they'll see that output window and see what's been executed on that bottom window there. Next example is scheduled task. So really simple, basic for an attacker to set up. It's easy as placing a batch file in a folder which is fairly obscure. So in this example, we have the Windows System Audit folder. The contents of the batch file can call up anything. In this example, it's using PowerShell and using a download string to download a particular payload, 1.psi, to the target system. Now, this is invoked every Saturday, at 2 a.m. by the task scheduler, and 1.ps1 is a reverse shell. So this allows an attacker a method to get back in without having to actually necessarily use malware at this point. But the persistent mechanisms are really just normal, commonly available tools on Windows. Next would be some exploits we've seen. So in 2019, 2020, we saw quite a number of, unfortunately, pretty devastating exploits targeting very well-known internet-facing technologies. And we have seen skilled attackers using these exploits as a method of regaining access to the environment. So if sometimes the target may not be patching in a fairly regular pattern, or they're not putting the mitigations in a reasonable time frame, it can absolutely be exploited, and we have seen this. On the right-hand side, there is some examples of ones we've investigated in our region. So the Citrix Netscaler, Pulse Secure VPN, and SharePoint, and obviously Apache Struts from a while ago as well. But I'll go over one pretty interesting example on Netscaler that we found, and we were pretty active, working pretty closely with Citrix as well on this one. So a lot of appliances are really built on some version of Linux or Unix BSD. So this means modules can be vulnerable. So in this instance, the Citrix VPNs had a flaw called template tool, which is a tool that's sort of built into Linux. Now, this was a way for the attacker to get in. So the initial exploit is up at the top there. We extracted this from HTTP logs. Next, you can see the next commands where this particular attack group used search and delete Netscaler D, which is a very popular crypto miner. So it's obviously so nice of them to delete crypto miners from our Netscalers, which is great. But then it will do a few other things. So to create a hidden staging folder, and then install some variants of the tools. Now, why we call this not Robin was it seems to be doing good, right? So the first couple of iterations of what it's doing, it seems to be doing some good stuff for us. So correcting the folder, making sure the correct folder is in the right folder, removing some more payloads and exploits. Deleting other exploits that they've seen, like for instance Project Zero India. But then it's also setting up an interesting listening port on UDP port 18634, and then also deleting certain files. We think this might be a mutex or potentially an avenue of return as well. So not Robin, like they actually stopped other attackers from deploying their tools, but we really believe it was just to stop the system administrators noticing that something obvious was happening. And we believe it was really used for a later campaign to detect detection from administrators. So that's why it's got not Robin, essentially.
Hey, Vince, that was pretty helpful, because I think what it talks about are different ways attackers could come back into the environment, and the web shell, the RDP, as well as the backdoor like not Robin. I also want to touch upon some, observations that we had from recent investigations that showed us different ways that attackers were managing their risks. So let's quickly run through that. And I just wanted to take a minute to set up background. Typically, when we see investigations, people focus on the systems that either have received the malware or that have been, compromised. Very few times we've actually seen organizations that are doing investigation actually look at systems that got access to see if anything was lost in terms of the data. There is also, a lack of coverage. So, while the attacker moves on to other systems or performs other activities, the focus is only on the symptom, but not on the problem, which is why attackers get back in. And one of the ways that we've looked at and recommended organizations to deal with investigations is to keep it iterative. You would get your initial leads, you would identify indicators based on that. Deploy the IOCs on your existing tools. These could be the different kind of security visibility tools in your environment. You are going to validate the systems that are suspect, but typically don't stop there. Post that, collect data. Now, what Mandiant does is live response. So, a lot of the findings that we have are based on that live response data collection, where we saw other activities that happened in the environment. Do analysis. Sometimes we found tools that had certain capabilities, and there are sometimes false positives. But once you identify that, you're rerunning that whole circle again with the new indicators to see that you've scoped out the attacker. And the process that you have a much better way to deal with the attacker in your environment and kick off the attacker without giving them too many avenues to return. So one of the things I did want to talk about was password resets. We see most compromises have a privilege escalation real quickly. They get to domain admin. There are a couple of questions that get asked usually. Reset the passwords. The risk of not scoping out the whole incident. But there's another one that came up was, what if the attacker can record your password changes, right? And in the investigation that Vincent led, we observed that they can. And this applies a fairly large Windows infrastructure right now. One of the things that we saw was using this DLL password implant. So the password filters that the LSA when you do a change password request, the LSA basically calls a password filter to see if the password meets a certain amount of complexity, and then writes it to the SAM. That's the typical flow that you can see on the top. Typically, what attackers would do is, what we've seen this particular threat group do is, introduce a bad filter, have that hooked into the filters that the LSA would call in terms of password filter. Now, every time you do a password change, the password filter gets called, but guess what? It doesn't do a validation check. It just writes the new password in clear text to a file or location that the attacker can access later on, or to a C2 so that the attacker has that data available with them. A pretty novel way for the attacker to learn about that. And this is because attackers, they assume, so they are also managing risk. They know that they could be detected. And we saw this happen on, one of the clients that we dealt with recently. A lot of domain controllers, restarted. Clients probably thought it was an issue, didn't really investigate all of them. We saw password filters set up on some of these. And while the blue team was resetting passwords because they had observed some of the activity, the attacker, was very quietly siphoning off about 800 to 1,000 passwords that got reset, and they had their foothold back into the environment. And the defenders, they had a false sense of security that they had identified some activity and they had asked the employees to reset passwords, not knowing that the attacker had a pretty good view into that environment. So yeah, very, very interesting method that we saw attackers use. Another one that we saw, and it's nice that Vincent spoke about some of the vulnerabilities on SharePoint. And if you have any questions on this one as well, or the previous methods that we spoke, drop a note on Slido. We're happy to talk about it. If you like what you saw, just give us a thumbs up. We'll be happy with the recognition as well. So just coming back to SharePoint, right? This is a vulnerability around the end of April last year. What we saw was attackers got in. They had a very small opportunity window because the organization they were dealing with very fast to patch, but had about a 2 to 3 day patch window. Got in and dropped web shells in their environment and went off. No further activity, just hoping that, when these vulnerabilities got patched, nobody would have gone and looked whether they got exploited. And the simplicity of the attack was, something that, Vincent and one of his colleagues worked on, and I just wanted to show that here. Echoing a base64 encoded script into a back file, which is stored in this location. Again, these are IOCs that are publicly available. You can go look at this if you do have this in your environment. The attacker used searchutil, which can actually decode base64 data, used legitimately, again living off the land, and had that output into error.aspx, and this looked like a simple China chopper web shell that the attacker could use later on. This was not the only web shell the attackers dropped. They used a multiple set of different web shells. We were tracking this threat actor. But again, a nice way for the attacker to use a small opportunity window, get in, leave a footprint, and get out. Web shells, backdoors. And if we don't have visibility to this, it'll be difficult to counter these threat actors. So Vince, I think we've better part of the conversation covered off. I think it's time to share some lessons. Why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so how do we tackle this problem with Netscaler? So as we learned earlier, the appliances are really just based on some version of Unix and BSD or Linux. So one of the benefits is that a lot of the common scripting tools and a lot of the logs that are available as well for us to investigate. So I've got some things outlined here. So in terms of detection, there was a HTTP log available, which allowed us to see what was more potentially the vulnerable item. So this is one way to check. Look, is the attacker trying to hit this particular file? Trying to get access to the Netscaler itself. You can also, because Netscaler also uses Bash, there's actually Bash history logs available. So you can see here that we were able to actually extract the actual commands that were executed by the attacker as well. Next, the persistence mechanism used by the attacker was a cron job or a scheduled task. So you can actually create a script fairly easily to start searching for these within your Citrix Netscaler environments. And we actually did develop a script. So if you need to find what that is, we can also please also hit us up on Slido to grab the link from us. But it is publicly available for you to search your Netscalers if you haven't put this mitigation in place as well. Steve talked about the password filter. So we can break this down in terms of the attack kill chain, which a lot of us as blue teamers are familiar with. So in the first review, you would look for things like abnormal access, especially for the domain controllers, which should be fairly well logged and monitored. Looking for unsigned DLL files is a very typical sign. It's unlikely that the DLL will be signed, but with attackers getting really good these days, there's a chance that there might be some weird signed binaries as well. Obviously, looking for abnormal changes in your registry keys, the LSA key especially. Looking for unusual server reboots may not be as easy on a workstation, but definitely your domain controller should not have these password resets. And the next one is look abnormal file writes to weird locations, and also is there maybe a C2 type connection using your security tools, maybe detecting this as well. before it hits the password filter. So these are some typical things we've seen work for us. In terms of, this is just a little additional thing that we also saw. IIS, again, is really just is a web server. It has a lot of extensions, right? So by default, ASPX is the default file extension to review. ISAPI filters are one way that IIS can expand its ability to ingest like PHP files, for instance. Now, these are all just DLL files in the end, and you have to register them into IIS. And we have seen these used as passive backdoors by targeted threat actors as well. Like the really good ones use ISAPI password filters, sorry, ISAPI filters for IIS. Detections, you have to be doing a lot of stacking extension and also looking at your configuration file. So having good environmental hygiene and knowing what's in your servers is really the key to detecting IIS filters, ISAPI filters here.
Hey, thanks, Vince. Let me take this from here. In terms of
Sure.
The aspects that Vincent spoke about, that very closely aligns with the third bullet point on your screen, right? The threat hunting program. We detected ISAPI filters at a client where an unusual extension would trigger off a different filter binary that was placed by the attacker, and then used to remotely trigger off activity on the environment. So having the threat hunting program looking for outliers is one of the good ways for the blue team to identify these kind of activities. The baseline for that is the top two points that I mentioned there, right? Do we have the right amount of visibility on these systems? You can't have the same peanut butter approach. Certain critical systems do have to have, logging a lot more stringent across the environment. But also review your log baselines to make sure that the right amount of logging is available. And for your key critical systems, have them defined and categorized so that people with higher experience monitor those. For the major avenues, right, which is RDP, which is again a major concern, and we've seen that used especially with the COVID situation, with organizations opening up infrastructure. So the things that Vince spoke about, Citrix, VPN, web shells, RDP, all of these are even more prevalent now purely because of COVID. Make sure that you leverage the restricted admin mode to limit your password exposure over there. WDigest, again, another thing that we typically hunt for. If that key's turned on, you would see password dumping in clear text. And a sysmon, so basic logging, just make sure that you have command line logging visible so you know what happens on those environments, when the attackers, if they're trying to run something on the environment. From a protection standpoint, blocking macros, for internet downloaded files, that would be something I would strongly recommend. App data, great place to store information, not a great place to execute programs. So again, have visibility to block programs from that location. Erroneous users executing scripts, so assigning scripts to actually run a notepad or text editor, which would limit the exposure. I know we're down to our last minute, so I wanted to talk about the one big gap that we see on exposure, which is 2FA. Anything that's exposed to the internet, make sure you have 2FA on that. VPN, Citrix, or WA365. Attackers love this way to get into the environment. Make sure you have visibility on registering off your 2FA and any bypass for your OTPs. In this time, it is important for the blue team to advise organizations to do this, and we wanted to leave you with this advice. Thank you so much for listening to us. If you have any questions and if we haven't answered them, reach out to us. We're fairly visible on LinkedIn. Vince, thank you very much. Anything you want to add?
No, thanks, Steve. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.